So welcome to week 13, and we're going to do something a little bit different now. For the next 3 lessons at least, we're going to break them into smaller chunks. And so week 13 will have an A, a B, and a C. This is actually day 7 as we're on our Israel trip, and there are some places that we're going to go to in Samaria that are also part of the territory of Ephraim up in the north, just past Jerusalem, actually between Jerusalem and the Jezreel Valley. And so in just a few minutes we'll look at some maps and some pictures of that area. But today we're going to concentrate mostly on Shechem and Sychar. Shechem is a town very significant in the Old Testament. Some very significant things happen there, actually. And so we'll take some look at those stories that take place in this place called Shechem. And then Sychar is the New Testament town. They were very close together, may have been even the same town at one point. Sychar is where the woman at the well is from. And so we're going to get a chance to see that very well, where Jesus met with the woman at the well, and we'll do that in today's lesson. So right now, let's head to the PowerPoint for week 13A. This is Shechem and Samaria.
So I want to walk you through just a few PowerPoint slides here to give you a general orientation and show you a bit about where we're coming at. So this should be familiar to you again here. This is our typical map. And this is the Mediterranean Sea, of course, the Arabian Desert over here. So far we've spent our time walking up the coast in the Jezreel Valley here, then up in the north, all the way up to Mount Hermon. Then we made our way down south this way, and then across over here, and then up in here in the southern part of the Negev down here, and then the Shvelah right here. And so last week we were here at Beersheba, Lachish. Didn't really spend any time at Azekah. This is the town nearest where the battle between David and Goliath happened, down in one of these valleys down in here. But so far we haven't spent any time at all in this little region right here. And that's where we're going to be now. I actually haven't got to Jerusalem yet either. That will be next on our list. But for now we're going to be up in this area, this largely uncovered area here. And we're going to make our way from actually north to south there. This is what it looks like from the satellite view. Again, it's the area between Jerusalem and Nazareth. Which makes a lot of sense as we're thinking about the biblical narrative, because as Jesus makes his way down from Nazareth or from Capernaum, he'll talk about having to go through Samaria, and that's this area here. Of course, he doesn't have to go through Samaria. Most people would walk down through the Rift Valley this way, or even cross all the way over the Jordan and walk on this side to come down to Jerusalem. But Jesus, of course, is after the people of Samaria, just as he is the Jews and the Gentiles as well. And so that's where he's going to spend some of his time right here. There's also quite a bit of Old Testament history that takes place there, and that's what we're going to concentrate on here first. So the places that we're going to visit in the next 3 weeks are Shechem and Sychar here, and then Shiloh, moving from, again, north to south, making our way back towards Jerusalem, and then Ai and Bethel, both in this region right here. So you can see them here, a little bit crowded there. Not far at all from Jerusalem, but Ai and Bethel will play a huge role in the biblical narrative as well. So that's our plan for 13A, B, and C. 13A will be up here, Shechem and Sychar. Okay, let me show you what that place looks like. Okay, this is the valley right around Shechem. In fact, the city of Shechem would have been back in here, in the valley between these two peaks. This is Mount Ebal over here, Mount Gerizim over here, and there's a valley that runs all the way through here that will run towards Shiloh, towards Ai and Bethel, back that way as well. I'm sorry, Ai and Bethel are going to be back this way. And Shiloh is going to be back this way too. If you go back up through this valley, you're actually going to come to the Jezreel Valley at some point. Okay. So this is the plain that we're going to be talking about here in just a few minutes, where Abraham would have spent time with his flocks and herds, and also Jacob later on would have visited this area. We'll talk about that in Genesis here in our first section. Again, here's Mount Ebal to the north, Mount Gerizim to the south, Shechem, the city in between here, okay? And Sychar would have been there as well. There's a great video. Of course, you won't be able to watch it through this video, but I'd encourage you, if you can go to the website, get to the PowerPoint that I've posted there. This link will take you to a video that is done by a group called Drive Through History. And it's a good video on Shechem and its importance biblically. So I'd encourage you to watch that if you get a chance. Of course, it won't work as you try to click on it here while we're showing the video. And here's modern day This is modern day Nablus. So this city here is the modern city of Nablus. This is all West Bank in today's terms. And so there's a modern city there that you've likely heard of. It was in the news a lot in the early 90s, late 80s as well. There's a lot of unrest in that area. And actually the very first time that I visited there in 2000, we actually had to have a police escort through that area for our tour bus. We didn't stop there. But we did go on a road through the middle of Shechem, and we had to wait for a police escort to take us through. There's no unrest there today. It is a very different place than a lot of the Israeli cities that we're going to get a chance to visit, but and you'll see a lot of difference economically, even the way construction is done, very different looking place. And in fact, when I drive through West Bank cities like this, I often get a feeling of being in Mexico. The construction is similar, and it's kind of the conditions are similar, and the way that people live is somewhat similar to what you experience in Mexico. So what else can I tell you about that? Again, this is Mount Ebal over here, Mount Gerizim over here. And if we think about our New Testament history, there was actually even Old Testament history. The Samaritans actually had built a temple up here as a place of worship. When Jesus talks to the woman at the well, she talks with him and says, you know, we say, the Samaritans say, that this is the place where we should worship up here on this mountain, but you Jews say that we're supposed to worship down there in Jerusalem. Which one is right? So they had their own temple and their own worship system, their own sacrifices all going on at the temple that was up here on this hill, which recent excavations have done quite a bit of work on that there as well. So the modern city here, you can see, is called Nablus. Nablus is actually a corruption of a Greek word for new city, Neapolis, but over time it got corrupted. People didn't want to say the whole long version. I don't know if it's difficult to say Neapolis, but eventually it became Nablus instead of Neapolis. Okay, so that's what the modern city looks like there. And then in the middle of the neighborhood here, one of the neighborhoods here in West Bank neighborhood, like I said, you got all these apartment buildings all around it. This is the ancient Tel. Okay, this is the ancient city of Shechem, right down here, which dates back before the time of Abraham. It was standing there before he got there, and he visited. And then we'll talk about how Jacob was also there, Joshua also there later on, and then the kings. This plays a role here. The capital city gets moved to Shechem for a period under Jeroboam as well. Just to show you some things, to point out some features of this from archaeology. So you've got a Middle Bronze Age wall that walks its way around here. The Middle Bronze Age, of course, is the time of Abraham, right? And so you've got they've done excavations, and you can actually see the wall here, and we will see the wall when we go there. Then you've got a Bronze Age gate out here as well. So once fortifications needed to be up to a new standard in the Bronze Age, that's where you get that. There's also what's called the Baal Berith Temple, and that's the God of the Covenant, and we will spend some time talking about that in the next section. Iron Age houses down here. Iron Age would have been the time of the kings, especially Saul, David, and Solomon. And again, a Bronze Age east gate over on this side. Okay, so not a huge tell, probably about 20-25 acres there on top. Again, down from ground level here, you can see the foundations of the temple there from the time of Joshua. Is it the time of Joshua? I'll have to come back and talk about that. But you can see the stone construction here. Again, foundations for a temple from that era. It's not Joshua's age. It's from the time of the kings. Actually from the time of the divided monarchy even. You see a large standing stone here, which actually does date from the time of Joshua. Okay, that would have been erected during the time of Joshua, and the story talks about that for us. Okay, that's just inside that temple now. Just some pictures here. You can see the outline wall of the foundations. You can see the stones that would have separated the courtyard from the inner courtyard, or the Holy of Holies. This would be the Holy of Holies, where the standing stone is in the back as well. Okay. And this is what the standing stone looks like. In fact, this was discovered not that long ago, and when it was found, it was actually twice as big as it is today. It just looks like a stone, but it's obviously been shaped and has a purpose for it. And then there's also a trench that was dug here and fortified so that this could be erected in there, stood up straight. And so it's a large trench there that encompasses that stone to this day.
So the first biblical mention of Shechem is actually very early on in Genesis, and it comes right after the Abrahamic covenant is given to Abraham. And this comes, as you all know, from Genesis chapter 12 at the very beginning. Genesis 12, 1 to 3 is the Abrahamic covenant. If you have your Bibles, turn to that section. It's Genesis chapter 12, and I'm going to be reading to you from verses 4 through 9. So just after the Abrahamic covenant, this is the first mention of Shechem, or Shechem as it's sometimes called as well. And so I'm in Genesis 12, verses 4 to 9. So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, To your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev. So Abram is up here in the north, in Samaria, in this region that will eventually be called Samaria at least. And he's a nomad. He's wandering with his flocks and his herds all over this land. And so he finds himself at this place for just a short amount of time, but he calls upon the name of the Lord there. And an interesting phrase that we're going to look at over and over again over the next 3 lessons, probably until you're sick of it. But it says that Abram pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And we will get to Bethel and Ai later on. That'll be lesson number 3 from week 13. But you're going to see that that's a very important spot as well for Abram's life and then for the life of the patriarchs after that. So the very first mention of Shechem is there very early on in Scripture in Genesis chapter 12. The next time that this place is mentioned in Scripture is down in Genesis chapter 33. And now we're a couple of generations later, and we've moved from Abraham through Isaac, now we're at Jacob's generation. And this is where we come to it in Genesis chapter 33. Again, if you have your Bibles, flip forward a few chapters. A famous incident happens here, a deplorable incident for sure, and it's Genesis chapter 33. I want you to notice there's a couple of similarities, though. Okay, this is a place that Abraham had been a couple of generations earlier, and now Jacob, his grandson, is there. So let's begin in verse 18, and I'll just read a couple of verses and then give you kind of the context for the story without reading the story that comes next. So Genesis 33, beginning in verse 18. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. Okay, so what I want you to notice here is the same place where Abraham had also sacrificed to the Lord. His grandson Jacob comes as well. I also want you to notice something else culturally that's happening here. It says that when Jacob came to the city, he doesn't go into the city, he goes to the region around the city. Okay, remember he is a nomad, he's a shepherd, he's following his flocks and his herds, and so he doesn't actually bring them into the city. Of course, the city would have been small. We've talked about what cities were used for in those days. And so he's camped before the city, as it says here in our text in verse 18. And so I want you to get that in your head as well, because over the next couple of weeks this will be important to understand that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs, they didn't tend to dwell in cities. They tended to dwell out in the countryside with their flocks and their herds, but they would come to cities for reasons of trade or maybe to negotiate treaties or even to find somebody for their sons or daughters to marry. And that's what's going on in this story here. And so chapter 34 is the incident that follows right after that. One of Jacob's daughters, Dinah, who was the daughter of Jacob's wife Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, it says in chapter 34, verse 1, they went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, that is, saw Dinah, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, Get me this girl for my wife. And so what follows then is an interaction between Jacob's sons and Jacob, and then the people of Shechem in that region as well. Okay, and there's a negotiation. They say, well, why don't you give your sons to be married to our daughters, and our daughters to be married to your sons? And that goes on until it comes to the point where actually Jacob's sons are acting deceitfully towards the residents of Shechem. They try to make a deal with them that they will intermarry with them if the people of Shechem are circumcised. And so they go through and are circumcised, but then they get attacked by Jacob's sons as they're recovering from their injuries there. Okay, let's fast forward down to the end of that chapter then, chapter 34. Let's go to verse 30. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, so this is the result of it, talking to two of his sons, "You have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." But they said, "Should he treat our sister like a prostitute?" And so this is the rocky relationship that begins between the nomadic patriarchs and those who are living in the cities. And so that kind of sets the stage for what happens later on in the rest of Genesis. But from now we're going to move on to a story further on down into history, down to the time of Joshua. And so let's take a break, and I'll show you where that is. Let's go to Joshua chapter 8 and fast forward a little bit. But I want you in your minds to have that timeline in front of you. And I'll put up a slide of that as well, the timeline that will give you an orientation in time as well as in place here. Again, we've mentioned before that oftentimes one single place is the setting, the stage, for a number of different incidences throughout history. And Shechem is certainly that kind of place. And so the next thing that we will encounter is Joshua's time in Shechem. And this is coming. So the next time we encounter Shechem in the biblical narrative is in Joshua 8:30 through 35. And this is literally more uplifting than the last story we encountered there, because now we're going to go up onto the two hills that we mentioned earlier. We're going to be up on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And so Joshua 8:30 through 35 is our next encounter. And this is the time after Joshua has begun the conquest of the Promised Land. Okay, so they've already gone into Jericho. They've already gone through Ai and Bethel. And now they come to this area where Shechem was. And there's a particular ceremony that had been spoken of in Deuteronomy that they were supposed to do when they got to this point in the Promised Land as they started the conquest. So they're already doing the divide and conquer strategy, and they've come and taken the middle, and that's where we find ourselves again here in the middle. And that's to divide between the north and the south. They take out that middle section, and after they do that, they have this time of dedication to themselves. Of themselves to the law. And so here we come to Joshua chapter 8, verses 30 to 35. At that time Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal. And again, as we look west from Shechem, Mount Ebal is on the right, or on the north side there. So just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the people of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones, upon which no man has wielded an iron tool. And they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord, and sacrificed peace offerings. And there, in the presence of the people of Israel, he wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written. And all Israel, sojourner as well as native-born, with their elders and officers and their judges, stood on opposite sides of the ark before the Levitical priests, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, half of them in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded at the first, to bless the people of Israel. And afterwards he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, and the women and the little ones and the sojourners who lived among them. So Joshua renews the covenant right here between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, in the presence of the people there. He has some stand on one side, some on the other side. Just as they were supposed to do, as directed by Moses. I want to show you again the timeline at this point, so we're going to bring that up on the PowerPoint part here, or maybe I'll just put it up on the screen behind me here. So we'll put up the Old Testament timeline, because again I want to get us an idea of how this all fits together. There are various different times that these things happen in this particular place. Good idea not to get lost in terms of time
along the way. So Joshua 8, let's fast forward again to Joshua 24, as we're talking about Joshua here. Joshua, again, after the conquest now, he's gathered all 12 of the tribes of Israel to Shechem. And this is where we come to Joshua chapter 24. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 2, and then we're going to skip down to verses 14 through 28. So Joshua 24, verses 1 to 2, this is the covenant renewal ceremony that happened here at Shechem as well. Joshua 24, beginning in verse 1. So Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and summoned the elders, the heads, the judges, and all the officers of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, now let's skip down to verse 14. Now therefore fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So that famous phrase that's found on a lot of household plaques around in Christian homes even today, that happened right here at Shechem. That's where Joshua spoke these words. He's calling for a decision between the gods of the land of Israel, who are no gods, of course, the Canaanite gods, or the God who created the heavens and the earth. And he says, as for me and my house, we will serve that God, Yahweh, the God over all the earth. Verse 16. Then the people answered, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us up and our fathers from the land of Egypt out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight and preserved us in all the way that we went, and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. But Joshua said to the people, you are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you, after having done you good. And the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua said to the people, you are witnesses against yourselves, that you have chosen the Lord to serve him. And they said, we are witnesses. He said, then put away the foreign gods that are among you, and incline your heart to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and put in place statutes and rules for them at Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. And he took a large stone and set it up there under the terebinth tree that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord that he spoke to us. Therefore it shall be a witness against you, lest you deal falsely with your God. So Joshua sent the people away, every man to his inheritance. Okay, so what's going on here is that there's already been a sanctuary built there, right? And likely that was begun back there in Joshua chapter 8, after they originally affirmed the covenant there, or reaffirmed the covenant there. And now, coming back after the conquest is complete, they come back to the same place, and Joshua stands, and by this time there's been you could almost call it a temple that's been built there, a sanctuary that's been built there. And part of that sanctuary is a stone that Joshua is going to erect on that day that he says will be a witness against the people. And he writes down on it the words of the law. And you guys, I think this stone is the very one that we saw in a picture earlier when we were looking at Shechem here. That is that very stone, I believe. And that had been preserved and kept in that place for centuries and eventually buried with the destruction of the city. But I think now found again by archaeologists within the last 150 years or so. So it's pretty exciting. I think we get to see the very stone that was there. And the fortress place that we come to when we are there in Shechem, and I'll show it to you, this temple, this fortress temple, commemorates what happened here. And it's built there on that spot where Joshua did the covenant reaffirmation ceremony there in Joshua chapter 24. So it's amazing, and I believe really that this is that stone, and we can actually see it and touch it when we go to Israel. So staying here at Shechem, our next stop on the timeline is actually down to the time of Judges. Okay, so after Joshua, the conquest, now we get to the time of the Judges. And one of the most famous judges, one of the easiest to remember, is Gideon. Of course, Gideon led, not by his own choosing, but because God chose him to lead. And he led very successfully for a good portion of his life. And at the end of his life, the people actually want to make him king. In fact, they want to make his descendants king as well. What's an interesting, I would say, recurring theme of the book of Judges is that the people are looking for a king like all the other nations. And what they have in mind is a king that will be dynastic. By dynastic, I mean that he will have his son to reign on the throne after him, and then his son after him. So there'll be a dynasty that comes out of that king. And what this provides for the people is stability. They know that when the king dies, the son, the heir, will be there to take over his throne. You see, what happens normally when a king dies and there's no one to fill his throne is that there's warfare, right? Somebody will claim the throne and they'll say it belongs to me. Another person will say, no, it belongs to me. And there's confusion and therefore warfare that happens because of that. Chaos. But with a dynastic king, you can avoid some of that chaos. You know what to expect when the king dies. And so that's what's happening with Abimelech, that is Gideon's son as well. When Gideon is coming to the end of his judgeship and to the end of his life, the people say, why don't we make your son king in your place? And Gideon says, no, this is a bad idea. But his son Abimelech has different ideas. In fact, Abimelech's very name is Avi-Melech. Av is the word for father. Melech is king. And so his name means, my father is king. Of course, Gideon didn't believe that, didn't think that he was going to be the king. He wasn't a king. He was a judge, not a king. And so it's possible that Gideon didn't name his son Abimelech, but that was the nickname that he took for himself. My father is the king, which means, of course, that I'm going to be the next king, that I'm the prince, right? And so that's what his name means. And so we're going to go to Judges chapter 9 now, and we're going to see how this story comes about. Again, the action happens here at Shechem, and now we're dealing with Gideon's son after Gideon has passed, and this is Abimelech, who is now trying to take charge and become king of Israel. Judges chapter 9, verses 42 to 49. On the following day, the people went out into the field, and we saw those fields around Shechem in some pictures earlier. And Abimelech was told, he took his people and divided them into 3 companies and set an ambush in the fields. And he looked and saw the people coming out of the city, the city of Shechem. So he rose against them and killed them. Abimelech and the company that was with him rushed forward and stood at the entrance of the gate of the city, while the 2 companies rushed upon all who were in the field and killed them. And Abimelech fought against the city all that day. He captured the city and killed the people who were in it, and he razed the city and sowed it with salt. Verse 46. When all the leaders of the tower of Shechem heard of it, they entered the stronghold of the house of El-Berit. Abimelech was told that all the leaders of the tower of Shechem were gathered together. And Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and the people who were with him. And Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a bundle of brushwood, and took it up and laid it on his shoulder. And he said to the men who were with him, what you have seen me do, hurry and do as I have done. So every one of the people cut down his bundle and following Abimelech, put it against the stronghold. And they set the stronghold on fire over them, so that all the people of the tower of Shechem also died, about 1,000 men and women. This tower of Shechem, this stronghold, as it's called here, it's actually called a fortress temple. And if you go back to verse 46, it says that it has a name. They entered the stronghold of the house of El-Berit. That El-Berit means covenant with God. What do you think that covenant with God is referring to? It's that renewal ceremony that was had under Joshua in that very same spot. Remember, we talked about it being right there on that spot where the sanctuary had been built. Well, this gets a new name. It's called El-Berit. That means God makes covenants, or the God of the covenant. And it's meant to commemorate that time with Joshua, where the people stood there and affirmed that they were going to follow God and follow the covenant stipulations that he had given to them. And so now we come to the time of the Judges. That temple stronghold is still standing there. And this is where the people of the city, they pack themselves into that place to avoid the armies that are coming to attack them. And this is Abimelech and his armies. They have refused to follow him as king, and so he's going to take his vengeance on him. He goes out and he gathers all those sticks from the city around, or the area around the city, and he brings it up and they burn the outside of that temple there. You guys, that temple is what we were just looking at there. And something unique about it is that the thickness of its walls. Normally when you find a temple, you don't find very thick walls in Israel or any archaeological excavations. Where you find thick walls are in or in fortresses, not in temples. But this one is actually a temple fortress. And some translations even put it that way. It is a temple built like a fortress. And that was what was standing there, and that's where the people go to protect themselves. It says over 1,000 men and women went into there. And though Abimelech came and he burned the outside and then killed everybody that was in, you can tell that it's 1,000 people who were able to gather in there. So it's a large building. And what we actually find there is part of the reason that the foundations are so wide is to support a tall structure. In fact, many believe that it was as many as 4 stories high. And reconstructions that are done of what that temple would have looked like, it would have had 4 stories for people to gather in. So a large place on this very same spot, and you guys, we can go there and touch the walls, touch that stone, touch the foundations that were standing there when Abimelech came and he burned this place to the ground. So that temple fortress found in verse 46, that's what we're going to go to here in Shechem. Another story to tell you here later on, and we're going to go down to the time of the kings next. So from Joshua to Judges, and now into the time of the kings as well, to the divided kingdom. Okay, so just a little bit of a review of biblical chronology. Okay, first of all, we have the time of the patriarchs, right, in Genesis, with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And we've talked about how Shechem played an important role in their lives, right? That Abraham had been there, Jacob had been there. There was a well that was actually built there that we didn't talk about, isn't really mentioned in the story of the patriarchs, but we'll get back to later, called Jacob's Well. And then we move into the time of the Exodus, right? We've got 400 years of sojourn for the people in Egypt, followed by the Exodus, which is followed by the conquest by Joshua, starting in Jericho and then moving up into the rest of the Promised Land. So that conquest period in the 15th century. And we saw how this plays a role in that as well. The first time Joshua gets there, he makes a mini covenant renewal ceremony with the people. And then later on, a full covenant renewal ceremony where he has people stand on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. So this place plays a role there. Okay. Then we also talked about how in the period of the Judges, even Abimelech uses this place. It's an important part in his story as well, as he follows in the footsteps of Gideon, although now wants to become king himself, and tries to do that by force right here at Shechem too. Okay. Not only that, from the time of the Judges, now we move into the time of the kings. And particularly I want to take your mind to after the united monarchy. Okay, so we have Saul, David, and Solomon, who all 3 reign over all 12 tribes, to some extent. Okay, mostly it's Solomon who gets a chance to reign over all 12 tribes. And at the maximum, this is a period of 120 years. 40 years for Saul, 40 years for David, 40 years for Solomon. And it may be somewhat less than that as well. And you'll remember from what we've talked about in class before, that there's a very important event that happens at the end of Solomon's life. When he dies, what year is that? 931, remember? Solomon dies in 931, and the kingdom then is divided. There's not a clear-cut heir to the throne for Solomon. In fact, it's not only about that. There's obviously theological reasons that are going on here too, not just genetic reasons that are happening. But God has also torn the kingdom from Solomon because of Solomon's disobedience, because Solomon followed after other gods, because he allowed the people of Israel, and especially through his wives, to become idolatrous, to worship foreign gods. And so God says, because of this, the kingdom will be torn out of your hands in the next generation. And so when Solomon dies in 931, there is indeed a dispute about who's going to be the next ruler of Israel. And there are 2 major possibilities. There are others as well that are minor. But the 2 major possibilities are Rehoboam, who is Solomon's son, and Jeroboam, who is actually a former guard. He would have been somebody who came up through the ranks in the army, gets to the point where he's a captain of in the army as well, and he's leading people in the army. And for a time, he becomes a threat even to Solomon during Solomon's lifetime. And so Solomon has him exiled into Egypt. But as soon as Jeroboam hears that Solomon is dead, he sees an opportunity to come to the throne himself. He sees that he can bring those who are loyal to him in the army, and that they can seize control of the kingdom. Not only that, but God actually comes to Jeroboam and makes a potential covenant with him too. He tells him, if you're going to be a man after my own heart, then I will give you the promises that I had given to David, and you will get to rule over all 12 tribes. But it doesn't come to that. It comes to the fact that he only gets to get 10 of those tribes. And so 10 of those tribes will eventually follow after Jeroboam, and they'll go up to the north and become Israel, while the 2 tribes that follow after Rehoboam will be to the south and will be called Judah from that time. Okay, so the reminder of biblical history. Now I want to take you back and watch where this happens actually in Scripture. So let's go to 1 Kings chapter 12, and we're going to watch and read how all of this came about. 1 Kings chapter 12, I'm going to begin in verse 1. Rehoboam went to Shechem. Okay, so this is again setting the stage. This is where we are coming again to this very same place. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. This is Rehoboam, right? And as soon as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, now Jeroboam is the one who had been in exile, and that's what it says here, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. Then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. Verse 3. And they sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. He said to them, Go away for 3 days, then come again to me. So the people went away. Okay, so this is Jeroboam approaching Rehoboam with a proposal that they make things easier than his father had. And it seems like Jeroboam is ready to follow after Rehoboam at this point if they can come to an agreement about how to govern the kingdom. Verse 6. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men who had stood before Solomon his father while he was yet alive, saying, How do you advise me to answer this people? And they said to him, If you will be a servant to this people today, and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. But he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him, and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. And he said to them, What do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, Lighten the yoke that your father put on us? And the young men who had grown up with him said to him, Thus shall you speak to the people who said to you, Your father made our yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus you shall say to them, My little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. And now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the 3rd day, as the king said, Come to me again the 3rd day. And the king answered the people harshly. And forsaking the counsel that the old men had given him, he spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So who's in control here? Is it Jeroboam? Is it Rehoboam? Obviously, it's God. And he has his plans for how the kingdom is going to be divided at that time. Verse 16 of this chapter, some of the saddest words of our Old Testament. Here it comes about. Verse 16, And when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, What portion do we have here in David? What is David? It's the kingdom, right? It's all those who are united in the kingdom. And so David would have been the king of all, and he has been promised to be king forever over Israel. But now they're saying, What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David. So Israel went to their tents. But Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. So Judah is the only one left in the south to be under Rehoboam. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was the taskmaster over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death with stones. And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. And when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly, and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. So there's the division of the kingdom between north and south. Jeroboam will be that first king in the northern kingdom, Rehoboam the king in the south. Not only that, but Jeroboam will make Shechem one of his capitals. Let's go down a little bit further in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 25 to 33. So just after this, Jeroboam decides to set up his capital here and altars in Dan and Bethel. Remember, this is the very first thing that he does for his kingdom, is he wants to make sure that people aren't going to return to Jerusalem to worship. And so he sets up 2 places in Israel where they can do that. One in the very northern part, which we've already been there, that's Dan, and one in the very southern part, and that will be Bethel, and we'll go there very shortly. And that's in fact our next stop, if you're thinking about this in terms of our bus tour there. So let's go to 1 Kings chapter 12, and now we're going to end verses 25 to 33. It says this, Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and lived there. And he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, Now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam king of Judah. And they will kill me and return to Rehoboam king of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now he's repeating exactly the same thing that happened with Aaron, right? He's building golden calves, and he's claiming that these were the gods that brought them up out of Egypt. So from the very beginning of his reign, he's already into idolatry, already forsaking the true worship of God. Verse 29. And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Then this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before one. He also made temples on high places, and appointed priests from among all the people who were not of the Levites. So he's taking people who aren't authorized to be priests because they're not Levites, and he's making them priests in his places of worship. Verse 32. And Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing the calves that he had made, and he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he had made. He went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, in the month that he had devised from his own heart. And he instituted a feast for the people of Israel, and went up to the altar to make offerings. So like I said, we're going to visit Bethel here very shortly, and this is going to be one of those false places of worship. It's also a place, though, that has a lot of biblical significance before that ever takes place, just as Dan had up there in the north. Okay, so that's going to be our next stop. But one more small one before we go that way, and it's not that small. It's a place where Jesus actually spent time in our New Testament. Okay, so not only does Sychar or Shechem have Old Testament significance, but even in our New Testament, when Jesus makes his way up into Samaria, he makes a stop here in this very place as well. And it's one of the most famous stories in all of Scripture. It's in John chapter 4, and it is the woman at the well. And so that's where we're headed next. We're actually going to head to what's called Jacob's well, the place where this well was dug by Jacob, and then was standing there already for thousands of years before Jesus sat down there with that woman and gave her an opportunity for the gospel as well. That happens right here next to this very place. So let's go down to that place as well, and we'll head there next. And I want to talk with you a little bit about how we understand what places are authentic and which ones may or may not be. Okay? This is a bit of a difficult thing to talk about because it takes us through all of history, I guess, if we want to look at it that way. Okay, so think way back to the time of Jacob, and we talk on the time of the patriarchs. And so we're talking about 2,000 years BC, even further back than that. Okay. So by the time that Jesus came to talk to the woman at the well here in Sychar, the well had already been here for over 2,000 years. Okay? So do you think that people understood and knew where that well was? Yes. And Jesus, when he gets there, he already knows that this is a famous well that has been there for for millennia by that point. Okay? So how do we know then that this is an authentic site? Especially given the fact that nobody lived in these places for some time during the maybe the period between the Crusaders and maybe modern times. So maybe 800, 900 years worth of history. This place was sparsely populated. And so when we come to a place like this, how do we know that this is Jacob's well? One of the great clues for an authentic site in archaeology is that is a place that is built on top of another place, on top of another place as well. And we see that with tells, right? You've seen that a place has layers and layers of different occupation periods throughout its history at a tell. But we also find that with churches or places that are meant to commemorate something else. And so what we have with Jacob's well is that we can see there's a church there that stands there to this day. But this is a modern church. It's a Greek Orthodox church that was completed actually, I believe, in 2006. So it's a thoroughly modern church. It took them a while to build it, but it's not ancient. It's not thousands of years old. But it does stand on top of a place that was built in the 4th century. So 400 AD, there was a church built here by the Byzantines. The Byzantines are those who follow right after the Roman Empire is converted to Christianity. So in the 320s, Constantine becomes emperor of the Roman Empire, and he doesn't immediately make Christianity the official religion, but he does officially tolerate it. And so it's the first time where Christianity isn't in peril of being persecuted from one day to the next, from 1 week to the next, from 1 year to the next, just depending on the whim of the emperor. Under Constantine, everything starts to shift. And he makes Christianity the official empire, the official religion of the empire. But within his lifetime, that doesn't mean that everybody turns into a Christian. But that will slowly happen as Christianity becomes the official religion. And so the Byzantines are actually the eastern part of that empire, which will build their capital at Byzantium or Constantinople. And from there, will expand the Christian empire southwards down here into Israel as well. And so as they do that, they go and find places that are known to be biblical sites. And so we're talking in the 4th century, 320s to 400 AD now. People are starting to go back to Israel and identify places where they can build places to commemorate, maybe churches, whatever it is, or monasteries, to commemorate places that were significant in biblical history. Okay, so in the 4th century, a set of people come down here and they explore, and they start to build churches on top of places that are well known. One of those places is right here. And how do we know that this is one of those places? Because Justin Martyr, who was one of the early Christian writers, and also a martyr, as his name even implies, he lived here in the 2nd century. So from about 100 to 165 are his dates of life, 65 years worth, starting in 100. And he lived right here in Shechem. And he's a believer, and he knows where Jacob's well would have been. Everybody in town at that time would have known where it was. This is less than 100 years, obviously, 50 or so years after Jesus had been there. Okay? And so he certainly knows where Jacob's well was, because he would have been told by his mom or those others who were living in that area. And so his records indicate where that well would have been, and there were other people, other Christians, who had lived here in that same place up until the 4th century as well. Okay? So you don't have an interrupted period in history where there aren't Christians living in Shechem. And they all know where Jacob's well was, because that's a famous place from John's Gospel. Okay? So that's what is commemorated. There's a church built here in the Byzantine era. As we come up to the modern Orthodox church that was built again just this last century, beginning in the 1960s, I think, and completed in 2006, we find the church there is built on top of the Byzantine church that was there before. And if we go around the back side of that church, we can actually see a mosaic that was on the floor of that Byzantine church. And so it's a much, much older church, 1,600 years older than the one we can see today. Okay? And it's right there on the same spot. And it points to Jacob's well in its architecture. Okay? So the way that it was built, the way that the floor is laid, points right to the well, being the central feature of that earlier church from the 4th century. That's how we know this is an authentic site. When we go inside, we will have to crowd around a bit in a small part of this church where the well is. And you can see it's a fairly big church, but the place where you actually can encounter the well is very small. And so we'll have to kind of crowd around in there, and hopefully we'll come to a place where we can all kind of see it and look at it. But as we do that, and actually as we do our time here together today, it's really good to read the story of Jesus there with the Samaritan woman. So let's go to it now. This is John chapter 4. John I love because he writes such vivid characterizations. He really is good at describing what a character is like, and we feel like we get to know them in a very short period of time. And that's the case with John chapter 4 with the woman at the well. Even though we don't know her name, we feel like we have met her just because of the familiar conversation that Jesus has with her there. So let's go to John chapter 4, verse 1. Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. So he's headed up north again to his hometown area. And verse 4 says, he had to pass through Samaria. We've talked about that before. You probably heard that before in other sermons. He didn't have to, except that he had a divine appointment to be there. This is Jesus, and he knows what he's doing, and he knows what he has to do, in quotation marks there a bit, that he has to meet this woman, that she needs to hear from him. Verse 5. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, You have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." This mountain there that she's talking about is Mount Gerizim, and we've seen that in pictures here already. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know, we worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him." Oh, so much could be said about that, but we're going to, for space of time, not talk about it today. Verse 24, "God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." Wow, that's a pretty direct statement there, and she now understands what he's saying to her. Verse 27, "Just then his disciples came back. They marveled that he was talking with a woman, but no one said, 'What do you seek?' or 'Why are you talking with her?' So the woman left her water jar and went into the town and said to the people, 'Come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?' They went out of the town and were coming to him. Meanwhile the disciples were urging him, saying, 'Rabbi, eat.' But he said to them, 'I have food to eat that you do not know about.' So the disciples said to one another, 'Has anyone brought him something to eat?' Jesus said to them, 'My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say there are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. Already the one who reaps is receiving wages and gathering fruit for eternal life, so that the sower and reaper may rejoice together. For here the saying holds true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap for that for which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor.' Many Samaritans from the town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. 'He told me that all that I ever did.' So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, 'It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world.' After the 2 days, he departed for Galilee." So that's John chapter 4, a wonderful chapter. We notice there that it says that the well is deep. Anyone want to guess at how deep that well is? It's kind of fun when you stand there. You can actually dip a bucket down into the water, lower it down and down and down and down, and then draw it back up, and it takes a while to do both of those things. And then you can get a glass of that water and just kind of dump it back in. You got to wait and wait and wait, and then finally the water hits the bottom. The depth of the well today is about 120 feet, so it's quite a ways down there, and it does take a while for that water to hit the bottom. And that's a great way to end our time here together as well. We've seen how Shechem and Sychar play a role all the way from the Old Testament into the New Testament. And we see how originally Abraham worshipped God there. We saw how Joshua made a covenant renewal with the people there as well. We saw then the important role that it played even in the division of the kingdom, right? That Shechem was made the capital by Jeroboam as he took the northern kingdom there too. He didn't set up his place of worship there, but he used it as his capital. Okay, and then we saw how it plays a role here with Jesus too in our New Testament. So it's a tremendously significant place, a place that not everybody goes on these tours. In fact, very few people do, but it's one that I can't wait to take you to. So I'm excited about that.